The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
I'm aware we do have another interview from you, Georgi. I'm in Aronia, so
Yes,
please
Georgi.
go ahead.
Actually, I conducted 2 more interviews. Getting Venture Ready, the event organized by Startup Grind Tbilisi and sponsored by the USAID Economic Security Program and Bank of Georgia, was held last Wednesday at Stamba Hotel. In attendance were 3 top venture capitalists from Silicon Valley who visited Georgia under the program of Georgia's Innovation and Technology Agency. We had a chance to talk to 2 venture capitalists one-on-one. One of them was Bill Reichert, a partner at Pegasus Tech Ventures, one of the investors at SpaceX, Airbnb, 23andMe, Coinbase, and many more. I talked to Bill about Georgia, our startup ecosystem, and the importance of formal education. Talking to Bill was an absolute pleasure. Well, Mr. Reichert, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's jump into the discussion straight away. How would you rate the Georgian startup ecosystem? Is it healthy enough?
The rating has a combination of level and trajectory, right? For every startup ecosystem, where are they now and how fast are they improving? So the Georgian startup ecosystem right now is at a sort of below average level, frankly, globally, depending on who you're measuring with. So it's pretty early, they're just starting, but the trajectory is phenomenal. I gotta say, I've been extraordinarily impressed. I've been here for 4 years. So I've seen over the last 4 years this trajectory of entrepreneurs from just a few years ago struggling to figure out kind of what this entrepreneurship thing is all about, to now they've got it, they get it, they understand it, and now it's a matter of, do the entrepreneurs have the experience and the understanding of how to scale a company beyond the borders of Georgia to be an international success? So I'm seeing tremendous trajectory for the Georgian entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so what we're thinking is it's quite possible that in the next sort of wave of entrepreneurs, we could get a couple of unicorns coming out of Georgia.
Do you have any companies in mind?
I do, but I don't want to name names. We had a few companies in this most recent cohort that JITA sponsored that are absolutely, clearly world-class potential. They have deep technology, they understand the broad market opportunity and requirements. You know, they know that, you know, yes, there's an opportunity here in Georgia, but there's a broader opportunity in the region, in Europe, and potentially in the United States and globally. And that's the kind of mindset that is just really impressive to have. They understand how they can compete against Silicon Valley startups. And that's what we want to see, and that's what you see in the most successful ecosystems.
Would you say that this mindset is something relatively new here? And if yes, what would you attribute that progress to?
Yeah. So it's hard for me to know, it's hard for me to know about mindset. I will say that, I don't know if this is sort of historically accurate, but people like me have this impression that this part of the world, including up through Eastern Europe, has this sort of residual Soviet leftover hangover in terms of sort of willingness to step out and, take a risk. And so I think what's happened in just the last few years with this sort of next generation that has grown up outside of that mindset, that is now much more cosmopolitan, and they understand what's going on in the rest of Europe and in the United States and around the world, that the framework now is much more open to this idea of, hey, there's an incredible number of opportunities out there for us to make a dent in the universe. And that's a very different mindset from, sort of a previous generation.
How important is the government's role in the birth of this ecosystem?
So I have the opportunity to visit innovation ecosystems all over the planet. And it's a tough question to try to find the right balance of government and private sector. And what I see in some regions is the government is too generous and lets the private sector off the hook. And what I've seen is the government is very important in motivating and in stimulating, but that motivation and stimulation has got to be to get the private sector to step up. Corporations and wealthy families and institutions, they're the ones that have to drive this. Because if the government sort of takes responsibility for this, everybody else just sits back and says, let's see how it goes. But if the government grabs the private sector and says, look guys, you've got to be part of this, that generally then is much more effective at doing things like developing a healthy angel ecosystem. So, if the government replaces the angel ecosystem, you don't have angels, and angels are critical for providing seed capital. And then, sometimes the government can stimulate the creation of venture capital firms, but that money really needs to come from the private sector. You've got to get the private sector sort of to have skin in the game on this whole innovation ecosystem development. And so the government is very important, but the government needs to have the right set of policies to stimulate the private sector to step up and to drive the innovation ecosystem.
So how would you rate the involvement of Georgia's government in the developing of startup ecosystem?
So I think they've been great given where we started from. And so Georgia was starting, my understanding from, it was 6-7 years ago, there was really very little, almost nothing going on in terms of any education on entrepreneurship or support for entrepreneurship or capital for entrepreneurship. So the government has stepped in understanding that somebody's got to push this. And so I think they've played an extremely valuable role in getting the entrepreneur world together. And so starting to develop a class or cohort of relatively young people, they're not all young, but of Georgians who are excited about entrepreneurship as a pathway. So they've done a good job with that. What I haven't quite seen yet is a robust angel ecosystem developing. I know, there are discussions about it, and I haven't quite seen yet a robust venture capital ecosystem developing. And I know they want to be supportive of that. And so I think the big issue is the government doing it right. The big issue is the private sector stepping up. And what we see around the world is the private sector has got to agree we're in this together. In some countries, what I see is the private sector competing with itself. No, we're going to be the leads. No, we're going to be the leads. No, it's our fund. No. And so you get the private sector competing rather than collaborating. And so in this space, why are you competing? Just get together and everybody wins. And so I don't know enough about exactly what's going on in the private sector here around this whole domain of angel capital and venture capital. But I strongly encourage the private sector to collaborate, come together, build a robust angel ecosystem, launch and support a few venture capital funds, get that experience into the private sector so that you can then sort of continue developing this ecosystem so you can support the next generation of unicorns.
Mr. Reichert, what do investors in Silicon Valley, including angel investors and venture capitalists, think of Georgia when someone mentions the country? What do they think of Georgian startup ecosystem?
Well, I mean, I know this is unfair, but if you ask investors in the United States what they think of Georgia, they say, well, yeah, there's some stuff going on in Atlanta, but not much.
How can we change that?
Sorry. That's the challenge, right? No, I mean, the reality is that U.S. investors are overwhelmingly focused on U.S. business opportunities, and so unfortunately, there's virtually no awareness of the Georgian ecosystem in the United States, and so I think there is opportunity there for, now that we're seeing some world-class companies that are coming out of this ecosystem, of supporting them and giving them exposure in the United States, in the U.S. venture ecosystem, or London or elsewhere in Europe, but giving the best of the Georgian entrepreneurs support and exposure in these sort of larger venture ecosystems like Silicon Valley in the United States, so that we know that there's actually something happening here. So, a few years ago, nobody in the United States knew anything about Estonia, right? Estonia just happens to be almost exactly the same size as Georgia, right? But Estonia, they were partially responsible for MySQL, and then they were responsible for Skype, and then they were responsible for TransferWise, and now there are a few others and every VC in the United States now knows about Estonia. Why? Because, Estonia managed to bubble up and percolate some world-class, unicorn companies. That's what it's going to take. We've got to develop some unicorns here, and that creates an incredibly virtuous loop, both locally and globally. And so I think that's the objective now, is to find some entrepreneurs that can become unicorns, that can put the Georgia ecosystem on the map.
Mr. Reichert, another topic I want to talk about is formal education. So you have a bachelor's from Harvard, and then you did an MBA at Stanford, which, quite honestly, when speaking to an investor, especially in our age, is very unusual, because sometimes you get very young people, college dropouts, and stuff like that. So how would you rate the importance of the formal education in today's world?
Well, okay. So there's sort of two elements to education, right? So there's skill set and there's mindset. And so skill set is extremely important. We got to have good engineers, right? Or we've got to have people who understand the elements of what it takes to start up and scale up a business. So you need skill set in an innovation ecosystem. Now, a lot of people pay attention to the very, very, very few number of dropouts who've been successful, as if that's the model, but that's not the model. You've got these, the model is a lot of great entrepreneurs are crazy people. And so, you can be crazy and finish your degree and you finish your education, or you can be crazy and not finish your education. But, there's this energy and passion that you need to be a successful entrepreneur, and that's mindset. And so, education traditionally is focused on skill set, but what's happening now around the world is increasingly universities understand, and even high schools and even elementary schools understand, that mindset is critical for life success. So, I think that historically, the United States, the better elementary schools and high schools, were really, really good at mindset as well as skill set, in the sense of teaching individuals to step up, stand out, and be confident. And so I go around the world, and a lot of entrepreneurs say, Bill, you Americans, you like to talk, you like to brag, but we were raised to be modest and not to stand out, and how do we deal with that? And I say, well, guys, stand up, talk, and brag. You've got to have that mindset. And so I do think, though we think of education as being skill set, in the United States, at my elementary school, my high school, Harvard and Stanford, a whole bunch of that was about mindset, not just about skill set. And that's what education needs to do. Some people have that independently, but others, need to grow and develop.
Can mindset be taught?
Absolutely.
So it's not something you're born with?
No, absolutely. We know. I'm involved with a program at Berkeley that is the Berkeley methodology of entrepreneurship, and they've specifically studied mindset and whether it can be changed in entrepreneurs. There's a lot of research that happened to have been done at Stanford by a woman named Carol Dweck, who studied, sort of the psychology of people. And a lot of people live on the spectrum between a closed mindset and an open mindset. And she was looking at sort of what characterizes these different mindsets. And then some people at Berkeley took that work and said, now can we change it? Can we change closed mindset to open mindset, or closed mindset to growth mindset, or to entrepreneurial mindset? And what they found is, yes, you can. You can. I mean, you can instill confidence in people once they have an understanding of this big unknown. They can be more confident. Once they have an understanding that they're not responsible for having all the right answers, they can build a team of bright people who may be even smarter than them. But there's all these mindset traps that traditional rigid education breeds in people that we need to break people out of. What we've discovered, some university programs understand that and develop that naturally. So when I went to Stanford, I wasn't planning on becoming an entrepreneur.
Oh wow!
That was not my plan.
So what was your plan?
My plan, I haven't said this publicly much, but no, my plan was I was going to go back to DC, work in the government, and do economic policy. Oh, wow. That was my plan.
To become a bureaucrat, basically.
No, I was going to become a big thinker, not a bureaucrat. but from the outside looking in, it probably would have looked like a bureaucrat, right? No, but I thought that was my intellectual fascination was with economic policy, right? And so there I am at Stanford. I'm surrounded by Silicon Valley and this venture capital ecosystem. I wind up meeting some VCs and doing typically for a business school student, doing a consulting project, doing a project for a VC. And I, observed at the time that there was this big hole that nobody had filled. And the VC looked at me and said, "Bill, why don't you fill it?" I said, No, that's not why I'm here at Stanford. I'm going to go do this other. Really? Why would you do that? You can always go do that, but now's the time to go to this. I said, "Really? Would you support that?" And I said, "Give it a shot." And so I gave it a shot. And, I wound up raising venture capital with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, and starting up a company. And we went to the moon until, actually, the longer story is that we were like a rocket ship. And then one day we crashed and burned. The whole thing blew up. It was a mess. But I was 20-something. For a couple of days, I was worth $16 million at the age of 20-something, and then I was worth nothing the next week. But the great thing about Silicon Valley, and this is also culture helping mindset, the great thing about Silicon Valley is when you crash and burn, in Silicon Valley, you just pick yourself up and you dust yourself off, and then you spin the story a little bit, and then you go do it again. And so I had a chance to go do it again, and a bunch of VCs gave me the opportunity to restart a company that was crashing and burning. They figured, I know about crashing and burning, so maybe you can figure this one out. And I went in with another friend of mine, and we turned it around and we took it public. And so, but traditionally, in some cultures, when you fail, the, sort of the environment around you teaches you you're a failure, and you start to think you're a failure, and you don't try to take risks again. Silicon Valley and Stanford and Harvard said, bullpucky, right? Just go do it, go do it. And so I was able to go do it. And so that's this culture that's important to support entrepreneurs, which is the university system's important, sort of government policy is important, but community support is also important.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Reichert.
My pleasure. Thank you.
In attendance was Marvin Liao, who is a partner at Diaspora Ventures, Gamesgroove Capital, and Bad Ideas Fund. Marvin also served as a partner at 500 startups for 6 years, where he created their flagship accelerator in San Francisco and invested in over 400 early-stage deals. I talked to Marvin about his investments, the Georgian startup ecosystem, and the government's role in this process. Let's watch the interview. Mr. Liao, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, it's a pleasure. So what would you say is the best competitive advantage that Georgia has compared to other countries in terms of startup ecosystem?
I think unlike a lot of other ecosystems, there's actually quite a lot of good government support. So like folks like JITA, really respect them a lot. And lots of countries have government support, but it hasn't been structured really well. And so I think they're very, very thoughtful. And I also think they also learn to sort of like listen and bring in sort of like expertise. So I've been really impressed with the program. I've been involved with the program now almost 2.5 years, and yeah, it's been really impressive, the progress I've seen.
How important is the government support in terms of startup ecosystem, and how does it compete with venture capital in any ways?
I don't think it does. I think it's so early, right? So in early days, you either rely on private sector. But if your private sector has no experience in venture capital, no experience in technology, they're usually not that helpful. And so you have to think about the government's almost like seeding, kicking it off and seeding things. No different than, there's these myths in Silicon Valley where it's like, oh, government wasn't involved. It's like, it was all government money in the beginning, right? The defense industry, DARPA, the internet, this is all government related stuff. So government's actually very, very critical in the early days.
So which spheres of business are you looking in when investing in Georgia?
I'm mainly looking, all the things that I typically invest in, right? SaaS, fintech, developer tools. I invested actually in a Georgian company last year.
Theneo.
Yeah.
Yes, Theneo, in my opinion and many people's opinion, is the Georgian startup that can become the first unicorn.
Yeah, potentially. We hope so. I hope so.
So could you expand on that?
It helps that the founders sort of have US experience. They're domain experts in the sense both for AI and in developer tools and API tools. And so they're the perfect group to actually go after this. And it's a massive space that's growing very, very quickly.
So what would you say are the synergies between Georgian companies and the US-based companies? How could they operate together?
I'm not sure about that. It's very, very helpful that most of the founders, most if not all the founders we meet here, English is pretty damn good. And so that's a good first step. I also think it's very, very helpful that the Georgia market is actually very, very small. And so you can't build substantially large businesses. You can make a good business here, but I think if you really, really want to build a massive size business, you have to think regionally and think globally from day one. And there's a forcing function of actually the small markets. So I think English language, small market, there's an opportunity for Georgia to be just like Estonia, right? Estonia is this tiny country that has done incredibly well and punches above its weight. Israel's another country, right? Punches above its weight. And I would say the other benefit that I think Georgia has is like a really, really deep creative and artistic culture. So design is very good here. That's a problem, for example, in Estonia. Estonia has incredible technologists, incredible sort of like IP and expertise, but like design is like not a strong suit over there, unlike in this region. And there's something about, when you think about startups and technology, it's the technologists, it's the business side, and it's the creative side, the creative design side. And Georgia has, I would say technology side is good, the business side is quite good, but the design side I actually think is what Georgia is very, very well known for.
But would you say that developing technological product here and then putting it on the US market where companies and people and venture capitalists and investors know how to sell on the bigger market is the potential synergy that can exist between?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, potentially. But I also think at the end of the day, you can't be relying on Americans to sell. You have to learn how to do it yourself. And so I think any founder, and this is what I've learned, I've invested all over the world, like I think 50 plus countries. I realize like founders from anywhere can grow in the US market. It's just sort of whether they have the mindset, I would say the mindset, the goal, and actually the willingness to sort of like take the punches and learn how to do it. You can do it, absolutely.
You just said that you invested in more than 50 countries. So what are the main areas that you're looking in, both in terms of the company and in terms of the founders?
Like I said, in sectors I'm looking at sort of like founder traits. I'm looking at actually the ultimate opportunity and how they, sort of how these companies are tackling old problems or new problems in very, very different ways. And so I don't know if there's like one thing I specifically look for, but like I said, stuff in developer tools, stuff in SaaS, enterprise software, like fintech related things. I tend to do more deals in that area. And so these deals, these awesome founders come from many different countries.
Do you have any particular companies you're looking at right now here in Georgia?
Not yet. I mean, I would say we were so busy with sort of the IC for the JITA grants program. And so we're doing an event right afterwards, so I'll let you know.
Let's talk about the event as well. With you being in the jury, what was the experience like and what are the companies? How did you find them?
Oh, so you mean like my impressions of the companies?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I mean, I said this actually at the ceremony, and this would be my 5th one I've done, and I will have to say it's been really fascinating and also really exhilarating seeing sort of the progress, right? Of just being coming here for the first time. So I was here for the Startup Grind event. I think that was 2019. I think Q4 2019, and then they were kind enough to ask me to join the IC this was February of 2020, and then since then, just watching just how much this ecosystem has actually progressed, right? The sophistication of the entrepreneurs, the experience of the entrepreneurs, I think the diversity of the really interesting ideas, and so the pitching even has just gotten better. So, now it's been 5 programs, every single program, you see some improvement. The baseline is moved up. That's an incredibly good thing versus other countries. Some countries, I'm not gonna mention, you go there and you're like, it's almost like they've gone the reverse direction where it's like, wow, like there hasn't been progress here, or there've been negative, like sort of, I would say, lack of progress in general. And so from my side, that actually makes me very, very bullish. These things take a long time, but the speed that it's actually happened in is quite exhilarating and interesting. And the other thing is just like how I look at progress. It's not just over short term. You look at short-term progress, but you look at long-term progress. This is going to be a very interesting ecosystem 5 years from now.
What would you attribute the progress to?
I just think it's like part of it's like there's an element of just building the community. So what the folks at Startup Grind are doing, what the JITA program, like they have different grants programs, so they kick off these big funnel of founders, and not all of them will be successful. But it reminds me of actually what happened in Bulgaria during like 2012, 2013, where EIF came in and just pumped a bunch of money in 2 different accelerators that ended up driving a lot of, invested and had a whole bunch of businesses they supported. Most of them weren't successful, but what's interesting now, if you look at the ecosystem in Bulgaria now, fast forward 10 years, they have multiple unicorns because a lot of these founders that weren't successful the first time ended up, starting again, or employees from these companies actually started their own companies, and they started getting critical mass that they actually have like lots of really interesting companies now. So all these things take time. And one of the things when I speak to founders or speak to investors or talk to government officials in any country I go to, it's like, it's not necessarily fair to compare yourself to sort of like Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley's been around in development for at least 60 years, right? 60, 70 years, you could argue, right? Even back to sort of World War II. And so a lot of that technology development, the schools, all that infrastructure, that took a long time to sort of like build. And so many countries are actually been able to, I don't think they'll be able to surpass, but to catch up in a much faster time period. And I think Georgia has an opportunity. It's a very nice place to live. You see a lot of digital nomads, lots of people coming here from all over the place, right? For sometimes due to sort of like unfortunate, awful, it's not just unfortunate, like horrible crises, like the war in Ukraine, but many Ukrainians coming here, many Belarusians because of the disaster zone that Belarus is, many Russians, right? A lot of the best Russian programmers and entrepreneurs are moving over here because of the disaster zone that their countries are in. And that's an opportunity where this is a nice place to live, mixing and mingling. If you think about most of Silicon Valley's successful companies, these are people not from Silicon Valley. These are people from outside the country. These are people from outside Silicon Valley. And so that mixing of that talent pool drives critical mass. And so that's an opportunity for Georgia.
Would you say the Georgian startup ecosystem today is self-sustaining?
I don't think they're there yet. It's still early days, right? It's only a couple years.
What needs to be done?
I don't have a good answer for that. I think there's smarter people thinking about that than me. I'm just a practitioner.
Well, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for having me.